Welcome to Tales from the Trails, a podcast dedicated to uncovering the rich tapestry of human experiences. Each episode, we delve into the personal adventures of individuals from diverse backgrounds, exploring their defining moments, challenges, passions, life purposes, and reflections. I am your host, Brian Facciandini. Thank you for joining us today. I'm thrilled to introduce Don Schwartz to our community. I met Don along the trails, and what captivated me the most about Don is his joy for life, all the adventures that he has taken in living life to the fullest, including his love for living in other cultures. Don, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for inviting me. This would be kind of fun.
Excellent. Well, let's dive in. Don, tell me a bit about yourself. Where did you grow up, and how did that environment shape you?
So my hometown is San Diego, and now I refer to myself as a mature man, so I'm in my mid-70s. So I was born in 49, so living in San Diego, I was one of the boomers, a baby boomer. I was born right after World War II. And living in Southern California, of course, everybody likes their hometown, right? But I thought that my hometown was the cosmic center of the universe because we had surfing, we had cultural diversity as far as food and languages to listen to. So I really felt that living in San Diego gave me a broader view, a more of a global view of the world versus most of my family are farmers, dryland wheat farmers in eastern Montana, and they live a pretty secluded life. It's better now, of course, but so I was always the gadabout kind of guy. People. I lived in Costa Rica for about 8 years, and people used to say, Don, your Spanish must be getting really good. And I said, actually, my Spanish is almost as bad as my English because I don't speak the Queen's English, and I don't speak proper American. I speak kind of Southern Cal surf slang with a little about Montana cowboy and some surf jargon from Costa Rica all mixed up.
Nice. So growing up in San Diego sounds like a wonderful place, and I've been there myself, having grown up in California, and I love San Diego. When you were growing up, were you surfing? What type of activities did you get into in your childhood?
Well, yeah, actually, I've had a love of water. It was funny because when I first grew up, when I was a kid, preteen, we realized that I had a morbid fear of water. And so my folks got me set up with a swimming instructor that broke that. And I went 180 degrees from being totally fearful of water to not getting enough, could not get enough
Amazing.
Water. And so then I've never been a ball sport. Closest thing to a ball sport I ever was I was on a couple different bowling teams, and it was pretty much a yuck. But baseball, basketball, tennis, all that, football, all that, I'm not golf, all that. I'm not into any of that stuff. So I started off as a surfer, and then I took up when I moved to Montana, and I took up snowboarding. I mean, I tried skiing and telemarking and all that stuff, and then I took up snowboarding, and snowboarding is just an easier way of getting a surfing experience. And I know that my friends in the snowboarding community always are argumentative because I've told them how much more difficult surfing is than snowboarding. And they say, oh no. And I said, here, let me explain it to you. If you're on your snowboard and you're at a ski area and you go down one trail twice, the third time you should be able to go down that trail blindfolded because nothing changes. It's exactly the same, and it's all muscle memory. And I told him, I said, when you're on a surfboard, every wave, whether it's your first wave or you've been surfing for 50 years, every wave is different. And you have to, it's a multimedia kind of an event because you're not only concerned about the water temperature, the direction of the winds. I mean, there's so many variables. And so a lot of people, in fact, I introduced my daughter to surfing, having been an accomplished snowboarder, and she found it very difficult.
Nice. Excellent. And I like the path and how surfing eventually evolved into snowboarding. Bringing it back, when you were surfing, did you find as a kid that you were making friendships and building community, knowing how many people in San Diego utilize the ocean, enjoy surfing? Was it a great way to build friendships?
Well, certainly. I mean, I was involved with the surf community. I knew a few of the legendary who ended up being legendary surfers. But actually, and it was years later that I realized that most of my friends growing up were like myself, were all only children. And so I never had any experience with siblings until I was an adult and seeing other families having sibling rivalry. I knew what it was intellectually, but I never knew what it was in an immersive experience.
Tell me a bit more about your experience as an only child.
Well, it gives you. It's funny because whenever I've talked, people that come from normal families, I'll call them, where they have siblings. People are mostly women. When I meet a new woman there, well, don't you get lonely? Aren't you ever lonely? And I said, I've never been lonely in my life. I'm self-entertaining. So, and I find that's a common denominator with only children. And I've got a daughter, and she's an only kid. And guess what? She's the same way.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. So it's a different way of looking at things. And although, as I said, I've been involved in the surf community and the snowboarding community, bicycle community, motorcycle community. But whenever I get involved in any of these community activities, I'm always on the edge, on the fringe, because I'm not really a group person. And the activities that I do, they're solo activities. In fact, a few years ago, before this catastrophic accident in 18, but probably in the early, 14 or 15, I was really interested in taking up kite surfing, and I realized that I went and took a class. I took a week training on it, and I realized that it's not a solo activity because you have to have a team of people to help you launch the device and then retrieve you. So I gave it up because I don't want to, I'd rather be by myself.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And then anything else that you would like to elaborate on about your youth, going through high school, those years that may have set the tone for your adulthood, if you will?
Sure. I grew up in an aerospace household. My dad worked for one company, but it kept changing names. But he went from building aircraft to building rocket ships, and that's the environment I grew up with. And I would often go out and watch test flights with him, and so that got me triggered into technology. So when I wasn't surfing or dabbling with playing guitar, I was always involved with researching and absorbing different kinds of technology. and it got me. It was one of the reasons that I got into computers at an age where in the mid '60s there wasn't a lot of computer stuff going on, but I got involved.
You had
with
access
it back
to
then.
it.
Yeah. So.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. And then as you transition from high school into the young adulthood, what dreams and aspirations did you hold for yourself? And secondly, how did the next years of your life unfold up through your 20s?
Well, I was, as I mentioned a moment ago, I grew up in a technical background, and so I realized that I certainly wasn't going to do what my dad did, because who does what their dad does, So originally I was going to be a photographer. I thought, this would be cool. I'll get to meet a lot of women and travel and all of that. And ironically, when I ended up I went to a junior college after high school. I went to a business school and a junior college, and I was dabbling in early computer programming like BASIC and Fortran and those kinds of languages.
Yeah, first generation language
right,
software, right?
Right. And what I realized was, everything was leading me towards really getting involved in computers. And in fact, when I decided that I was stretched too thin because I was dating the boss's daughter, going to junior college and working, I didn't quite have enough time for everything, so I quit school. And again, in 1968, when you quit school, I got drafted. And so that was a pivotable point in my life. Wow. So I went from being...
And this is what grade did you quit school?
Well, I was in the first year of junior college. Mm-hmm. So... and once I stepped away from junior college, then, of course, my 2S got converted to a 1A, and I got drafted. So,
and this is drafted to which war?
Well, I went in and went through all the procedure to become cannon fodder in the Army. I mean, become a foot soldier in the Army. And then one of the neighbor kids that I grew up with said that he was going in the Air Force, and he said, why don't we go in on the buddy plan? So I promptly enlisted in the Air Force. And I thought they promised me that I could work on computers. Well, it didn't work out, but that's okay. But that took me in a whole different direction. And actually, I was kind of ensconced in Southern Cal up until I went into the military. And when I did that, then I explored the world, and not to return. So.
Sure. Yeah. I know that some of our veterans and the experiences they have, it may be something that it's difficult to communicate or to share. Is this something that you want to go a little further deeper into, or just highlight over? It's your preference.
There's my military experience was not unique. There's a rare amount of veterans that have had experiences like mine, but like say 40 or 45 years ago, when I was like 5 years out of the military, it's pretty active, and I spent a lot of time talking to people about it. But now, literally over 50 years away from being in the military, I don't think there's anything that I could add that hasn't been written about or filmed or television, or it's
sure.
And it's funny because recently I've realized that I'm in a position now, being a veteran for 50 years plus, that when I was a kid in the 50s, I remember seeing and hearing interviews with veterans from the Civil War.
Wow.
And I was always amazed as a child that I knew, I didn't know them, but I witnessed interviews with these men. And here I am now, 50 years later, and now I'm an old combat veteran, just like the Civil War veterans, except now I'm a Vietnam veteran, which is old. I'm an old guy, although I'm not tottering around so much, but anyways. So, I mean, I can recommend books. Well, not really, but I mean, there's some powerful films out there. I think that and I think that what I found, especially when my daughter was for instance, in middle school, she's now in her late 30s. So she was born in the 80s. And what I realized when she was in middle school is when I looked at some of her textbooks, there was no mention of Vietnam at all. I mean, it was really interesting for me to realize how revisionist history can be presented to children.
Yeah.
And it was disappointing, to say the least. But, that whole campaign of exploration and sharing knowledge, I'm over it for 50 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I've kind of gone through it. So,
and
I don't feel. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I can imagine an experience like that, and has an impact in the years to come in one's life. And that being said, from your time in the military and as you transitioned out, what skills may it have developed for you as you transition into the work world? And those experiences, how did those help you, and what did you get into after the military?
Well, first off, there's a lot of terms that have been used over the years: combat fatigue, battle fatigue, lots of different shell shock. I mean, all kinds of different terms. Well, as I recall, I think it was in the 80s, the U.S. government did a study and they developed this phenomena called PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I was actually one of the early interviewees and participated in developing that whole idea. So I used to refer to myself as a PTSD poster child. But so when I say that, I want to set the stage to try to respond to your question. So I spent some years, probably as much as 10 years, certainly at least 5 to 6 years, of being quite lost and disoriented coming back to America from the combat. So I wasn't just stationed in a backwater place somewhere. I was in Vietnam in a hot zone. And so coming back to America, and again, it was not unique for me, but any combat veteran that comes back to the States, you see your home in a different way. And what it did for me is that at one point, I thought I'll just get through this service and then I'll just go back and be the happy-go-lucky surfer playing guitar that I was. But when I got out of the military, I realized that I had changed. My global view had changed, and although I spent, I think, a couple of weeks with my folks, I left and I spent about 8 months circumnavigating the U.S. trying to figure out some place that I wanted to live, because Southern California, San Diego specifically, in less than 4 years that I was away, I came back and I was totally overwhelmed. And I had to get away from the din of the crowd, far from the madding crowd, so to speak. So I was lost for a number of years, and then I went to university and enjoyed my time at university in Montana State University in Bozeman. I went there for a few years, and during that time I had a girlfriend, and she got to the point where she was ready to graduate. So I went into the admissions office and I said, so I'm ready to graduate now. And they said, well, you haven't fulfilled your obligation for some of the prerequisites, like underwater basket weaving and accounting and things I had no interest in. I said,
our favorite courses.
I don't want to take any of those courses. And they said, well, if you don't take those courses, you won't get a degree. And I said, that's fine. I don't need a degree. I've got the information I needed. So what happened, because of my relationship with this woman, young girl, like I was a young man, it took me away from getting a degree. And by not having a degree, it prevented me from developing a career in certain areas. But it also allowed me the freedom to pick and choose exactly what I wanted to do. So it was probably as big a shift as going from being a guitar strumming surfer in Southern California to go into the military. That was a big change. Then the next big change was, of course, when I realized that I was going to step away from the university, because it wasn't, I've always sought knowledge and information. In fact, sometimes I refer to myself as a data whore, because I'm always absorbing information, whatever. It could be paint colors. It could be a new kind of chili. It doesn't matter. I'm just always absorbing information. And I realized that by stepping away from a formal education, it allowed me to express my ability to be autodidactic. Autodidactic.
I thoroughly love vocabulary words, terminology, definitions in meeting, but that's one I don't know. Can you share real quick? And
sure.
Then also, it reminds me of like Steve Jobs and these other folks
Totally.
who left college to explore their own path. And at that time, did you have some vision or interest and then vision for where you wanted to go next and what was in store for yourself in your 20s?
Okay, so I'll do the autodidactic definition first. And this is not a dictionary statement, but this is my understanding. So you can look up autodidactic. Autodidactic is the ability to self-learn. And most people, they have to have a cheat sheet. They have to have instructions. They have to have a teacher. They have to do this and do that. And I have the ability, and anyone who is autodidactic has the ability that you want to learn something, you just research it, and then you figure out how you want to do it, and then you just do it. And I think that it's interesting that you mentioned Steve Jobs, because, and I've never been kind of a what-if person, but it would have been, had I not gone in the military, had I stayed in junior college, continued to work at the company that I was working, where I was dating the boss's daughter. He was the vice president. It wasn't really the boss, but that I could have met Steve Jobs. I could have been Steve Jobs, but I stepped away into this military thing, which was a head turner, to say the least. But so anyhow, so the autodidactic feature has allowed me to pick and choose what I want to pick up, not underwater basket weaving or accounting. So that was the autodidactic. And the other question was,
So at that time when you decided to move on from college and not finish, did you have some interest in mind, and what may have been your vision at that time, and where you would like your journey in
Sure.
life to go next.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I got tied up in the autodidactic stuff. But anyhow, what I realized once I stepped away from the university, my girlfriend and I, because she graduated, and we decided we were going to go out to Seattle. And she was in law. She was pre-law. And I was heavy into photography. I thought I was going to be a photographer. So when we moved out to Seattle, we spent a month out there pounding the streets looking for a job. And this is in the mid-'70s, kind of. And neither of us could find a job at all. So we moved back to Bozeman, Montana. And then our life took a different direction. But I was still kind of post. I wasn't post. I was suffering from an unidentified malady, which we now call PTSD, or shell shock, combat fatigue, any of those things. And so it, as I said, it really affected me and distorted my worldview quite a bit. So,
and sorry to interrupt. The question came to mind earlier when you were touching on this, and I'm curious, were you able to connect with a therapist, understanding that, as you mentioned, you're one of the early interviewees about PTSD, so it was new to society. I imagine they might not have had the pharmaceutical drugs if one chooses to go that route. And what they, in all the resources that they have available today, my guess is they likely weren't available then. So what was available to you? Did you use or engage in therapy, talk therapy? How were you able to navigate those years? Because I can understand how challenging it may have been for you, and then leading into your career and being able to navigate that period. So,
well, I'll say that, again, it was not a unique, I mean, it's certainly a unique feeling experience that I had, but I realized as I finally accessed therapy, which took me over 10 years from getting out of the service to getting into therapy, because I got out in 72, and it was about 84 or 85 when I finally found some therapy. And it was at the behest, it was a suggestion from my, at the time, wife, who had a friend who somehow had become aware that there was a veterans center that veterans could go in and talk to some people. And so it took me, I suffered for it untreated for 10 years. And in that 10-year period, when I said earlier that I was kind of lost, so I was self-medicating, and I self-medicated with anything I could get my hands on. So that was, of course, street drugs and alcohol. I mean, those are, and, you know, and alcohol is the government-approved escape depressive kind of thing, and recreational drugs were not accepted, but everybody did them. And so it took me, like I said, over 10 years to finally get involved with what would end up being the formal diagnosis of PTSD.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
You bet.
And so...
Oh, can I want to just add one thing? So, again, so the transition going from being in the military to getting out of the military, you know, historically, like when the combat men, the combat veterans came back from Europe or Japan, or the Pacific theater or the European theater, they were showered with welcome home parades, ticker tape parades, that sort of stuff. When we came back from, and my belief is that it was never a declared war, so the police, the Vietnamese experience, for me, it was a police action, and it was an unpopular activity. And so when we came back, we received a lot of disrespect. So so what I wanted to do was just get away from all of that. So I've ended up spending my life being much more comfortable, not only by myself without being in a relationship, but again, the PTSD has prevented me from being comfortable, for instance, at a big sporting event or a big musical event. Whenever I've been at a large musical event, I found myself being on the peripheral of that event. And so it's amazing to think that my active duty time was slightly less than 4 years, and I was really only in direct combat for 13 months. How impactful that is or has been. And I will say that I want to touch a little bit more on PTSD. People have often said, how long does it take to get PTSD? If you heard that, that was my finger snap, and that's how long. A blink of an eye or a finger snap is how long it takes you to contract PTSD. Like if you're in an aircraft crash or a train wreck or a car wreck, you can get symptoms of PTSD. But the devastating component for combat veterans is that we never had a blink of an experience. We were in harm's way. I was in harm's way for 13 months, 24/7. So that negatively, that blink of an experience that can trigger PTSD, when you're 24/7 for 13 months, constantly, your life is threatened for that long, it rearranges your brain. And so a combat veteran suffers PTSD in a much more significantly severe way than someone that's been in a bank holdup or a rape or, all those things are powerful negative experiences, but they're always kind of brief. And when you get prolonged negative reinforcement, it stays with you. It's hard to let it go.
Yeah, I can imagine. And going back to what you had mentioned earlier, and I heard the experiences of vets coming back to the U.S. and many people not treating them fairly. And I can only imagine how that may feel, because it's, 1, you're going to duty, 2, you're being required to do it, 3, you're being thrown into combat where people are trying to kill you. And as you mentioned, for 13 months straight, 24/7, it's unfathomable of what you may have gone through, and then to come back and nobody's appreciating the service that you provided. That's so disheartening, and I can only imagine the impact and what you've been through. And as you alluded to, it sounds like over time, in the 50 years since, you've been able to manage and to work through the PTSD. So while the early years were difficult, as I'd like to stay on this subject a little bit, because it's now in mental health is becoming more familiar to us, advocated on, discussed, worked through. Myself, I've been involved in it and have also faced traumatic events. Nothing in close comparison to yours, but mental health is close to me, I should say, both through the service I do and my own experiences. So over time, how have you worked with the PTSD? Have you been involved with the field to advocate or provide feedback? Has there been follow-up from the VA? And then, I guess, what's your view on it today, and with all the work that's coming about, or any thoughts there?
Sure. Well, I've got plenty of thoughts, of course, because I've got 50 years of experience dealing with this. But I will say that luckily for me, in the late 80s, in the late 80s through the VA and one of these veterans community locations. I met a therapist who was not a psychiatrist but a psychologist. And I have ended up, I've known this woman for that long, for 40 years. And she actually retired last year, but we still, once or twice a month, will touch base. She'll call me, I'll call her. And without, I mean, this woman was like the most important sounding board I'd ever had. I mean, I can think of several different role models I've had or mentors over the course of my life. But this person, this woman, this therapist was the sounding board for my emotional stability, that it was so instrumental in helping me get through this, because I find that most of my fellow veterans, and I'm not talking about all Vietnam veterans, I only know, probably less than 100 veterans really, but intimately, closely know, I probably know 36 veterans. And most of those veterans are still suffering because they haven't taken some necessary treatment steps to get through it. But I decided early on, once I realized that there was a resource for me, that I took advantage of that resource. But it's always in my mind every day. One of the classics is, oh, you have anger issues? And but what I do now with my anger issues is, and I don't just count to 10, but I have a variety of processes to help me detox those triggers that used to make me go off on people. And when I say go off on people, just to be clear on that, if I lose my temper with people, I mean, there's a lot of different terminology you can use with that, but the nicest way I can say it is that I've found methods of managing my responses so that, if I'm clear-headed, I can manage myself. If I have 3 drinks or smoke a marijuana cigarette, my guard is down. But if I'm clear-headed, I can pretty much most often manage myself so that things don't escalate and get into maybe a legal challenge or physical altercations. So I feel lucky to have had that experience, and that's been lifelong. I mean, I got started with that in the mid '80s, and I finally stepped away. In fact, I pretty much have stepped away from most of my fellow veterans just because so many of them are so kind of stuck, and it's easier for them to stay in their denial stage. Although I have tried to help men break through that, and with various things, maybe paddle boarding or hiking or yoga, and I've tried to help other veterans get involved with that. But so many guys are really stuck, and I didn't want to weekly. I used to belong to a group of guys that would get together for coffee, and then we'd go bowling, and maybe we'd have lunch. Well, now it got to the point where they didn't really want to bowl. They just wanted to talk about their ailments. And I was such an active person that I stepped away from the veterans for the most part because I was wanting to grow, and I didn't see them making those same efforts.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's great that you're able to recognize that, have the self-awareness, and then just living more so in a conscious state, and you're recognizing your thoughts, you're recognizing your behavior where you could alter that. And so you understood, I have this process. if this behavior comes up, here's how I'm going to work through it, which ultimately sounds like it led to having a happier life, living a life more fulfilled. I've realized in getting older and also taking on advice of sometimes we have to set boundaries and we have to let people go, even though we may have a special connection or bond with them, in order to continue to grow and not succumb to what may have been a negative aspect of our life. So I think that's really big of you for sure.
And, I wanted to just add this whole experience, this lifetime experience that I've had dealing kind of like post-combat, okay? One of the more fascinating things is that it's helped me realize how I view change and the ability to explore whether it's a new location or a new taste or a new type of music, but I am always looking forward and I'm ready to embrace change because we all know that change is inevitable, but I also find that most people are very uncomfortable with change. I mean, if they have macaroni and cheese, Kraft's mac and cheese on Thursday night at 5 p.m. every Thursday, that's what they're going to do. And they get comfortable doing that. And they don't want to have a hamburger at 6 o'clock. They want their mac and cheese at 5 o'clock. And it's made me realize, for instance, just recently I've had several experiences where I've found, by one way or the other, I've been introduced to some new restaurants, and I'm real happy with these restaurants. So I invite my friends to join me at the new restaurant so they can try some of these new menu items that I think are unique signature items of these restaurants. Well, the funny thing is I just had this experience with two different groups of people within the last 2 months. And the first couple, we went to this new restaurant. And I said, "Oh, you got to try these things because I've never had it like this." But they, instead of ordering something new, they ordered something off the menu that they already knew that they enjoy, or it's their favorite dish or whatever. Well, then of course the dish came out and it wasn't the way they were used to having it. No, of course not. You're in a different restaurant. They're going to make things differently. And I realized that people, so I love to try new everything, whether, again, it's new music, a new flavor, a new location. But most people will do anything to prevent because they don't want to fail. I think failure is a huge problem in America because people don't want to fail. And for me, I like to make mistakes because every time I make a mistake, it's a learning experience for me. It's the way kids learn how to walk. You don't just, when you're 2.5 years old, mommy doesn't say, "Get up and walk, damn it." It doesn't work that way. You have to fall a number of times to where you get your balance and stand up. And of course, I've just had that same experience happen 5 years ago because of this accident that we might talk about soon. But so anyhow, I have no fear of failure because I always learn something. But I find most people are so encumbered with the fear of failure, they don't want to be embarrassed. Wow, did anybody see me fall down? For me, it's like, hey, why not?
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great insight, great analogies. For our community of listeners, I'm sitting here smiling because it's a topic as well that's near and dear to me that I had been aware of because it impacted my life and changes I was going through late teens to early 20s, and where I focused on similar to yourself of adapting to change and then looking at how others in society have such a hard time of change. And following being involved in the personal development field, I see this as a big challenge for folks, but I love how you embrace it, and with the fact that you are looking to learn from every time that you have to change. So bringing it back a little bit to with the PTSD, and if folks, combat veterans, are facing it today, or maybe future veterans, what advice would you give people who are suffering from PTSD and trying to overcome the challenges that they may be facing?
Well, there are no silver bullets. So whatever, if you the first thing, is that you realize that you have, for instance, that you suffer PTSD symptoms, and you have to consciously decide that you want to get better. You want to change your behavior. You don't like the way you feel, and you want to change that. The advantage of society today is that there are resources for people. For instance, any veteran has access to the Veterans Administration, and the Veterans Administration is a tremendous tool for people. And I think for non-veterans that may suffer, because as we discussed, there's lots of triggers for PTSD. And I think there are social programs that are available at low to no cost, but I don't want to be quoted on that. I don't know.
Social programs in the form of engaging with others, doing activities with others, and collaborating.
Right. And the collaboration as far as like a group therapy session. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just like going to an AA meeting, only it's not the same, it's different. But those I don't know what it is, but I find if someone is addicted to drugs or addicted to alcohol or addicted to improper behavior, that the first thing that has to happen, most people are in denial. They're not really, I'm not really eating 5 donuts when I should only have 1 donut. They totally, or does this dress make my butt look big? Well, you're looking in the mirror. What do you think? You don't need someone to tell you that your butt looks big. I mean, I find that in today's society, we have more resources for corrective action, but I find that most people are lazier and lazier. They don't have any interest. They don't want to get better. This is the way I am. They don't want to learn a new word. They don't want to learn a new language. They like Kraft mac and cheese at 5:00 on Thursday. That's what they do. Well, if you're not willing to make accommodations, I mean, you can't negotiate with someone that their only response is no. No negotiation there. So.
Yeah, nice. Excellent. I appreciate you sharing that advice and being willing and open to share about that experience in the military combat, your challenges with PTSD that have carried on from combat. I'd like to shift gears now and put some focus on your career experience. Once you got going in the right direction, how did your career path evolve, and maybe what unexpected turns did it take?
Okay, so it was a very non-linear career path. It was I loved riding motorcycles, because it's such an exhilaration. It's such a high, it's so stimulating. And the way that is the best part of motorcycles is not driving on the loneliest highway in America for 150 miles in a straight line, but driving through the curves and heeling the bike over, those kinds of things. And so my career path, as I said earlier, I grew up in an aerospace household, and I knew I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be artistic. I wanted to be an artistic photographer. I didn't want to be a portrait. I didn't want to take portraits. I didn't want to take baby pictures. I wanted to create art with photography. And I spent a few years trying to do that, but I always had to fall back on maybe construction or maybe doing some computer consulting for people, but I never quite got to where I could consider myself a professional photographer. So at some point, I realized that although I had no degree, which of course, whenever I would apply for jobs, well, what kind of a degree do you have? Well, I don't have a degree. Oh, well, we can't. We require, it's mandatory you need a degree. And upon reflection, it initially used to get me very angry because I said, I know more about this particular topic than someone that's got a PhD in it because I've lived it. But I couldn't break through that. You have to have a degree. So it took me into a different direction. So I tasked myself in different ways. And what I finally realized is that when I went to university and I didn't get my degree, my major was photography with a minor in philosophy. And so my actual career ended up being I was a non-degreed mechanical design engineer. And so I was an inventor. I didn't like to use that term, but that's what people called me, an inventor.
Yeah, sounds fascinating. Tell me more about that.
Okay. And so there were just things that someone would say, I can't figure out how to get this thing to work. And I just know it. I would intuitively know it. And so I finally thought, how did I get to the point of being a highly sought after mechanical engineer in the high-tech industry? And what I realized is that I thought back about my experience at Montana State University, and I realized that for instance, the photographic studies that I did, one of the components of photography in the 70s was, because it was all still film, it wasn't digital, it was analog film, there was an elaborate manufacturing process. Because you get your camera, you load it with film, you take pictures, then you take the film out, and then you could drop it off to the drugstore and get it processed. Or I learned how to process that film. I made my own. I had my dad help me. We built a color darkroom, and I had all that stuff, all that equipment. But what can I, if I'm not a photographer, what am I going to do with that? Well, the takeaway from that, I realized, was it taught me manufacturing process. So in other words, it's like, how do you build a brick wall? One brick at a time. You put one brick down and you stick another brick next to it and then one on top of it. And that's how I design things. But it's a learned process that you have to have that process. So at one point, I was working for a very small company. I was working with a bunch of British aerospace engineers. These were the guys that came up with the Harrier aircraft, the vertical takeoff aircraft, military aircraft. And because I had grown up and I saw some early prototypes when I was a kid, they wanted me to come work for them. And I realized that, so that photographic background helped me. How do I design things? How do I establish the protocol to develop a design? And then I realized that my minor in philosophy, that gave me the ability to discern the why. Why do we want to build this? Why do we need it? What should it do? So I had this, and these two areas photographically, which is an artist kind of a thing, but it's got some hard technology involved. And then the philosophical thing gives you more of a woo-woo experience. But those two kinds of sets of information are not normally included in the mechanical engineer's education. So that they come out, they got the pencil protector, they got the degree, they got the haircut, they got the right tie, but they don't have an original thought.
Mm-hmm.
And
There's so much about the practical experience and application of that experience in life, in the work world, as compared to the book reading.
Exactly.
And where it can take people.
Right. So, and I think that it's a fallback on my self-proclaimed autodidacticism. And also, having traveled a bit with the military, it made me realize that traveling was a very large portion of my life, because for many years, because whether I was on the motorcycle or I was in a car or I was flying or sailing somewhere, but I'm always looking for the next whatever, anything,
excitement,
the next
adventure.
anything. Yes, the next adventure.
Nice.
So,
thank you for sharing that. And so, you touched on travel a bit. I know that you love to travel, live in foreign places. Can you tell us more about your travel adventures?
Well, travel adventures. I mean, in my, one of the other phrases I've used before with people is I said that it's important for me to maintain a childlike wonder, because most people, they get through whatever education, whether it's high school or college, university, whatever, and then their inquisitiveness goes away. And it's important for me to have that childlike wonder and be curious about things. And part of that curiosity is, wow, I've never been there before. I'd like to go over there. I'd like to go try that kind of soup. I'd like to go put my foot in the water in that lake or in that ocean. And so for me, travel, and most people, I've spent most of my life trying not to have a lot of Klingons, like, I was going to go for a motorcycle ride, and I asked my friend if he wanted to go along. I said, hey, Tom, do you want to go for a motorcycle ride? Well, no, I got to walk the dog and mow the lawn. Well, then he's got his itinerary of things to do, and he doesn't allow himself the flexibility to change plans and maybe go for a motorcycle ride. Right, be spontaneous. And so spontaneity is important for me. And I found that in relationships, that attempting to have interpersonal relationships, it was always very difficult, because at some point the woman in my life wanted to set some roots, and for me it was always, I'm a wandering minstrel, I'm a vagabond, and now that doesn't work to have a family to act like that, you know. And so, and it was mostly traveling and being interested in always new things is a way for me to manage getting stuck in a rut. Because when I've worked in manufacturing environments, or whenever I've been involved with something that becomes extremely predictable, I have the tendency to disconnect from that. If it's predictable, I always want a new challenge, which I find is it's not unique, but it's a rare trait that I have, that I don't, I have a high standard on most of whatever I would value, and it's difficult for me to rein that in and just get into a more of a mundane existence, which is what I find. I could have a relationship, for instance, with a woman, but it would be, I would have to modify, I would have to accept some activities that I'm not interested in doing. And I've just gotten to where I'm so selfish that I'm not interested in that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So thank you for sharing. I can now see what has driven your desire for travel adventures. What are some of the most memorable places you visited, and why?
Well, for instance, although I lived, because my hometown San Diego, so I was in a port town, so I was exposed to a lot of the culture as far as languages and foods. But it wasn't until I went in the military, because I spent, other than just basic training in Texas, all my military experience took place in Asia, whether I was in Japan or Vietnam. And so, for instance, the very first time I went to Vietnam, I was on a riverboat on the Mekong, and I looked around and I realized that Walt Disney must have visited Vietnam, and he was doing mescaline when he did it, because it was such a different environment, and it was everything was intense, saturated, like saturated colors, saturated sounds, saturated smells. Everything was alien to me. And, oh, by the way, my life is at risk. I'm in a hot zone. At any given moment, I could get shot, I'd be dead, or I'd get blown up, or whatever. And so my senses were I wasn't on edge, I was way above that. I was hyper aroused. And that's what I ended up being. That was the success for me to survive Vietnam. I accepted the hyper arousal, and I acted on it instead of denying it and trying to figure out how I could be safe, because there was no boundary line, there was no war front. It was all around you, and the psychological damage that kind of a threat is, it's such a, well, it affects you for your life.
Yeah, I can imagine that. As far as in your, post military experience, in your personal life and beyond, in retirement, what places have you visited, and I guess which one stands out to you where you feel at home?
Sure. Well, it was interesting because I had a great relationship with Costa Rica. I was there for 8 years, and I was very happy being there. I went down on a yoga retreat initially and fell in love with the country and wanted to stay. And unfortunately, in 2018, I had a pretty catastrophic motorcycle accident, which I had to come back to the U.S. My injuries were so severe that I had to come back to the U.S. reluctantly, but I had to come back to get my life saved. And so since that time, since 2018, my worldview has changed a little bit in that I become even more selfish because I put my health in front of everything. So it's changed the way that I look at travel. I mean, I was always up for anything, always up for an adventure. And now when I frame travel plans, it's within the confines of, I used to be able to do anything I wanted, and now there are only a few activities I can really physically do anymore, one of which is bicycling in a certain way with a certain kind of a bicycle. And the other thing, I love the water, and it's such a nurturing place for me to be, but the only thing, I can't surf anymore because I physically can't snap or pop up on the board. But what I can do with some modified equipment is that I can spend a lot of time on a paddle board. And that is currently has been my favorite activity for some years, and it's why I'm going to yet a new country for myself, and that is Panama is in my sights. And I'm hoping to spend a lot of time on the water. So in other words, initially for many years, most of my life, travel was always a new adventure. And now, since this last catastrophic injury that I had, my travel parameters are, how can I go to this place and accomplish the few things that I can do anymore in an enjoyable way? Because I'm not interested in going on a cruise ship. That has no interest. So the travel that I do still has to be able to, I have to be able to do the things that I enjoy, which is good for my mental health, but also my physical health. Mm-hmm. And so getting those, the mental health, for me anymore, is a little easier to satiate than my physical needs, because my physical needs are, I like to be in the water. I like to be in the water because if I fall off the paddleboard, the worst thing that can happen to me is I get wet, unlike falling off of a motorcycle, for instance. It causes injury.
As you travel to these different places, for those that may have fear or anything else that's hindering them to get out and explore, to get out and try new places, what's your approach when you're going to a new country and keeping it open to the potential of staying there for a longer term? How do you approach that?
Well, that's a great topic, and there's some elements involved. And so one of the things, I'm going to get there, but I'm going to come around the mountain on it. And I'm going to say that I've always lived in tourist towns. I mean, I grew up in San Diego. I lived in Bozeman, Montana. I live in Denver. I lived in Costa Rica. I've been to Germany, wherever I've been. But anyhow, and so I've always lived in tourist areas. And so because tourist areas are always the nicest parts of that town, that city, or that country. And so, but being around tourists all the time, when you're not a tourist, when you're dealing with tourists, you have to develop a certain kind of, maybe you can't have thin skin, and you have to be patient with people. And what I find the most glaring thing, the biggest problem I think Americans have when they're going to travel to another country, and it kind of goes back to how people view change. Most people view change as an obstacle. I view change as a challenge. And the problem is, most Americans, when I see Americans in another country, they go to, for instance, they go to Costa Rica, but they want to have American food. I mean, they want to have everything that they have at home, but they just want to be in a foreign country. So they fail to acknowledge that, I mean, and I think, well, I don't want to get too political, so I won't go there, but I'll say that, so Americans, when they travel, they're an American traveling somewhere, and they want to be acknowledged as an American, and so they can snap their fingers for service, they can complain unceasingly. And so for me, when I see Americans misbehave, because they don't really, I don't understand why Americans travel, because every American tourist I've been in that I've met in another country normally complains about some part of the country that they're in. Says, if you don't like the country, go back to America. So what's the advice for someone, an American, to successfully travel into a foreign country? Forget about their Americanness. If they want to go explore another country, explore the next country. Don't go there and ask where the next Mickey D's is.
Yeah, sure. I think that's solid advice, and my takeaway there is to get more ingrained with the locals and enjoy the culture and let go of the roots and where you may come from, or the pride that you may have for the country that you come from. That's great advice. So, of all the places you've been, what's your favorite dish, and what country does that come from?
Well, for instance, when I was in combat, that wasn't like a fun thing. But I will say that it was fascinating when I was in Vietnam, because I hadn't realized before I was there that before the U.S. was involved with Vietnam, the French were there for over 50 years. And they affected Vietnam in ways that most people would never think about. I mean, they helped them convert their verbal language to a written language. So there's a lot of similarities between French and Vietnamese. And and I had never had French food. I mean, I grew up in San Diego, so I had Mexican food, Chinese food, Japanese food. I had a lot of Portuguese food, I had seafood, I had lots of gastronomic exploration, but I'd never had French food for some reason. And so I got introduced to French cuisine in Vietnam. And the country was one of the most beautiful countries I've ever been in. Unfortunately, I was in the middle of a hot zone, so I had to keep my wits about me. But, and then the first time I went to Costa Rica, so it's probably tied between Vietnam and Costa Rica, because Costa Rica has certainly been the most fun place I've ever been. And the coastline of the area of Costa Rica I was in reminded me of Southern California from the 50s. Which, of course, now, for instance, California has no public beaches. It's all privatized. And I grew up when it was a public beach, which is one of the reasons I love the state of Oregon. All their beaches are public, but unfortunately the water's too cold. Of course, now the water's too cold, and even Southern California, to be out spending extended times in the water, which is another reason I love Costa Rica and Panama, because it's Central America near the equator, and the water and the air temperatures, there's not a large range. Like here in Colorado, we can go from 30 degrees to 70 degrees in a day. And in Costa Rica and Panama, the delta temperature might be 10 or 15 degrees annually. It's always 75 or 80 degrees. And in Colorado, it's not. And I'm at a stage in my life where I don't need the 30 degrees anymore because there's nothing when it's snowing, there's not any activities I can do other than ensuring that I don't fall down and break a hip.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Sounds like you've been on some fantastic adventures in all of your travels, and it's great that you've pushed your boundaries and gotten out and explored. I can't say that I've been into French food, but I'm inspired now to go try that, knowing that they're really good with the foods and cuisines that they cook. Shifting gears a little bit as we move along and wind up with today's show, we got some questions and that I'd ask. What brings you the greatest joy in life, and how do you incorporate that into your daily routine?
I think that about 2 years ago, I'd say, I guess I finally decided that I'd spent so many years recovering from this catastrophic accident in 18 that I finally made a decision. I said, you know what? I'm gonna tell people I'm not in recovery. I've recovered as much as I can, which is maybe 90 to 95%, but I'm not going to recover anymore. But now I need to enjoy my regained physical abilities and go do things. And so that's one of the reasons why I've decided, again, to relocate to a more friendly ocean available location. Because in Colorado, I'm finding I'm spending 60% plus of my time just waiting for an opportunity to go do something I can do. Whereas if I'm at a beach, or more importantly, living on the water, I have immediate access for 365 days to get out to do what I'm doing.
Sounds amazing. And what are your core beliefs about life, and how have they evolved over time?
Well, I realize how precious life is. And speaking of precious life, the most precious life, in my view, in my life, my most precious life to think about is my daughter. And so the most favorite thing that I can do is spend time with my daughter, because she's a busy person, as most people are these days. She's a stage actor in New York, and so my time with her is limited, but whenever we're together, it's the best. She acts often as a muse for me, whether it's cooking something new or deciding on a new place to go or read a new book or whatever. She's quite a muse for me. So,
that's amazing. What's been your proudest dad moment?
Pardon me?
What has been your proudest dad moment?
Oh, God. Well, so many, but I guess I would say that, and I have to again wind up on this, it's not just one blanket statement, but so I will say that when my daughter was young, I always went to the school plays to see my daughter as the little mushroom or something. Well, she started doing these acting camps in the summers, and I remember that the older she got, the farther I kind of started to live. And so I remember she was going to be in a play, and it was going to be in the Boulder Theater, and it was Oliver. And my daughter, I didn't know before I went, I didn't know what role she was going to be in. So I go to the Boulder Theater, it was beautiful, and they had a couple of scenes, and then the curtains went down and came back up, and the scene changed. You could see the skyline of London, and then you saw fog rolling in on the stage. Well, all of a sudden, out of one side of the stage came this young person singing and dancing, had a top hat on with a cane She was dancing, singing in a Cockney accent, and it was my daughter playing the Artful Dodger. And that was amazing because she wasn't my little mushroom in the school play. She was really an actor. And she was a teenager, she was still young. And so I've seen her trajectory, her career arc is going. And although she is focused on stage work, she has done some films and she's done some voiceovers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But so that brings me the most joy. And then
Nice.
probably the greatest joy is seeing her do what she does. And the second most fun thing is whenever I can do because I savor when I'm on a paddleboard, I savor each stroke of the paddle. I mean, and in fact, in January, I visited my friends in Panama, which was a trigger for me to decide to move there. And the first time I went to get on a paddleboard down there, I fell in the water. And they said, oh, we're so sorry you fell in the water. And they said, this is nearly embryonic. It's like re-entering the womb, I said it was I've been waiting 5 years to get back into the ocean because I consider myself a waterman, and the big water is the ocean. And when I'm in a lake, on a lake, or falling into a lake in Colorado, it's a lake. I mean, what's in there? Bass, trout. I mean, when I'm in the ocean, I'm paddleboarding with manta rays that are 12 feet from tip to tip. I'm out there with whales. I'm out there with turtles.
Wow.
That's the ocean. That's the environment that I want to be in. And I don't have, unfortunately, I'm boring for another 24 years. I want to go for 100, but I'm not going to be an active person. So I figure I better go down to Panama and get some licks in on the water for the next 3 or 4 years. And then I can come back and take up knitting or something. But I'm still an active guy.
That's awesome. Good for you. And thank you for sharing that moment about your daughter. It's really beautiful, and it sounds like she's had a great career adventure. And as we look to wind it up here, Don, a couple of questions for you here. One, can you share what have been the most important lessons you've learned in life?
I think staying calm, having a calm mind. Most people are too frantic. And I mean, you can be busy and do things, but you don't have to be so spun out. In fact, part of the therapy that I received through the VA to process my PTSD was having conversations with people. And I find that to have a meaningful conversation with someone else, you have to have eye contact and you have to listen to what the other person is saying. And I find that most times when I start a conversation with someone, that they're so busy thinking about what they're going to tell you next that they're not hearing what I'm saying. And so it's almost like their eyes roll back in their head and they've got a story they want to tell me. So they don't want to have a conversation. They want to tell me something. And I find my goal is if I'm going to have a conversation with someone, I want it to be a two-way street. And so I focus on trying to get people to interact with me instead of just talking at me.
That's beautiful. Yeah. That's a really good lesson, and for those trying to learn how to build relationships with others and communicate, please take in this advice. Then another question, what are you most proud of, and how would you like to be remembered?
Well, I would say career-wise, the thing I'm most proud of is that I was intimately involved in the development of a non-invasive oximeter. And what that is that, and most people have seen one, it looks like a clothespin that goes on the end of your finger. And when you're in the doctor's office or a hospital, and what that does is it determines how much oxygen is in your blood, and that's a great diagnostic tool. And before the group that I was with developed that, they used to, for people that they needed to accurately track their oxygen level in their blood, they had to draw blood hourly to determine. And now it's something on the end of your finger and you push a button and it gives you the information. So that's the thing probably I'm most proud about. And professionally, and then I think being involved with co-creating this most amazing, talented woman that is now my daughter, you know?
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And how would you like to be remembered?
Well, not crazy, that's for sure, but beyond limit, I guess. Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm an adventurer and I'm a traveler, and I think to keep your mind open to new experiences, to be, in other words, to be open-minded, and that's what I feel that I'm an open-minded guy and have, against probably a lot of odds, I've succeeded in certain ways. Mostly still living.
Yeah, great, good for you.
Yeah.
And I think open-mindedness is probably the best approach to take to life. And yeah, so great for you. If you could give one piece of advice to our listeners based on your experiences, what would it be?
Well, tying in with being calm, being patient, allowing things to unfold instead of forcing something. Let things just unfold. As a flower unfolds, I think your knowledge should unfold. You don't have to pack it into 3 years in college. You don't have to, and once you get out of school, the world is your oyster, and enjoy it and don't get hung up. Deadlines, well, here's my 2 least favorite things: worry and regret. And I've given both of those up, because if you worry about something, you're defining, you're focusing on something negative. And I'm not a negative person, so I would urge people not to worry about things. And then there's only one thing worse than worry. And what's worse than worry? Regret. Because regret is past tense worry. So you can worry about making your car payment or meeting your girlfriend on time or whatever. That's current. But if you worry about, God, I should have asked that girl out on a date when I was in high school, and that was 40 years ago, and you worry about that, it's a regret that you have. It's long term. Let it go. Move on to the next thing. So I'd say regret and worries are things that are induce negativity and prevent someone from realizing their full potential.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And being patient and not forcing life is amazing advice. Going with the flow. And that is a beautiful way to live. Thank you, Don, for being on the show today. What an amazing life. Adventures, tribulations, hardships, but making the best out of life and what you faced and the challenges you faced. um, the life lessons that you've shared today. I've taken away some great advice. I hope our listeners have as well. I'm sure there's some more details in all these amazing stories that you have, but with today, I'd like to just wrap it up, and I hope our listeners have gained some insight in as far as understanding those that are in our community, those that are around us, in these fantastic stories and that are being shared, in the wisdom that we can learn from our elders, and the life experiences that others are having. I hope you were able to gain a nugget of wisdom or two from Don's adventures. And with that, be well, and until next time, have a great day.